I'm Halil Yenigun. I'm the Associate Director of the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies. Welcome to our event, this very special event of ours. On many different levels, it is very special for me as well. First, Yasemin İpek, she's our graduate. She got her PhD from the anthropology department over here. So this book is a child of this institution in that sense, and also for the Abbasi program, because she also was one of our summer grantees, our very popular summer grant program. I hope you know it, and thank you so much for the acknowledgement of our Abbasi program in Islamic Studies. So that way we also have the pleasure to have played a part in the like the production of, not production, this book coming out basically. And she's also like my college friend, going back to Turkey, for more than 20 years. And
now they know our age.
Yeah, yeah, they know my age. Yes, Yasemin İpek is an assistant professor, actually now going to be associate professor, just got her tenure. Congratulations. In the Global Affairs program at George Mason University. So I went to UVA, so it is our sister school. She received her PhD degree in anthropology from Stanford University. And she also has a second PhD from the Department of Political Science at Bilkent University in Turkey. Her book, Crisiswork, Activist Lifeworlds and Bounded Futures in Lebanon, came out in 25, and it explicates the relationship between crisis and political imagination by examining the popularization of activism in contemporary Lebanon. She did quite long field work in Lebanon. She lived there. For her second book-length research project, she's studying transnational humanitarianism in the context of Syrian refugee crisis. And I believe you initially set out to do your fieldwork in Syria, but then after the Arab Spring, I did. Her work has appeared in journals such as Cultural Anthropology, American Ethnologist, the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, Political and Legal Anthropology Review, the Muslim World, and Turkish Studies. So in this talk, this is going to be a book talk, and we do have books available for purchase outside. Crisiswork, which is also like a term that she coined, presents the story of Lebanon through the lens of activist Lifeworlds, showing how, amid crisis, both political structures and everyday life become a terrain of generative possibility. Through an ethnographic investigation into the relationship between crisis and political imagination, Yasemin İpek examines activism as an open-ended process, looking at the diversity of experiences that leads to ambivalent political engagements. She follows a range of self-identified activists, including unemployed NGO volunteers, middle-class consultants, and leftist entrepreneurs, as they crisis work and respond to contradictory pressures, leads them to new ways of being and acting. The crisis work demonstrates how class-based and other inequalities on local and global scales affect the lived realities and political imaginations of activists. It provides an innovative analytical framework for understanding the complex political and social struggles against crisis in the global south. Please join me to welcome Yasemin.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. It's really exciting to be here. As Halil mentioned, I graduated from here. I spent a lot of years here, some bitter, some happy, obviously as a PhD student. And I am very grateful to be invited here, and I want to especially thank to Halil and Zerrin for making this possible. They definitely worked a lot on so many details, and I'm very, very grateful. And thank you all for coming. It's really, nice to have this opportunity to share my work with you. As some of you know, it takes a lot of time to write a book, so it's good to celebrate it in this particular way. And just after reviewing some of the key ideas and points, I really will look forward to your questions and comments, and if in any case you need to leave earlier, I also will look forward to emails from you in terms of feedback and everything. So before even going into what is this book, who am I, why did I write this book, and etc., I want to read a short section at the end of the introduction that is called The Book and You. Something special for me about this section is Kate Wall, who is the editor of the Stanford University Press and who's certainly a very angelic person in so many ways. I think many of us are publishing books thanks to her patience and support, unbelievable support. And all editors support writers, but I think there's something exceptional about her. So I want to also remember her. So she's like, well, at Stanford University Press, we don't do this, book summaries at the end of the introduction, but we still need some sort of book summaries. How can you introduce the book in a way that doesn't, do the traditional chapter summaries, but at the same time still transitions into the book and prepares the reader for the book? And I came up with something little experimental, and I appreciate that she loved and endorsed it. And this 3 paragraphs is something that I read in all of my book talks. So hopefully it will help us to nicely transition into different themes in the book. The Book and You. Thank you for your interest in this book. Whether you know plenty, nothing, or something in between about crisis, activism, Lebanon, anthropology, or decoloniality, I wholeheartedly welcome you. I wrote this book for anyone who, regardless of their level of knowledge or expertise, is curious about the complexities and ambiguities of everyday life in Lebanon as experienced by activists. Crisiswork, the open-ended process of activist struggle for undoing crises and enacting change, offers a unique window into the broader political, economic, and cultural dynamics of contemporary Lebanon. In this sense, this book is about both Lebanese activists and broader Lebanese society. It is also about politics and ethics in relation to lived and perceived crises. The ethnographic research that undergirds this book does not delimit Lebanon by territory, sect, class, or ideology. Instead, it documents open-ended encounters among multiple actors from different locales and identities, in delineating the various ways in which crises generate complex responses and engagements. Each chapter details how diverse groups in Lebanon, most under conditions of precarity, simultaneously embrace and contest competing modalities of political agency, ethical citizenship, and effective selfhood. While Western donors and local elites praise Lebanese civil society for fostering shared identity and culture and civic activism, Crisiswork shows that Lebanese activists live such abstract dreams and their endless deferral in ambivalent ways. Diverse activist modalities of Crisiswork are deeply rooted in the contingencies of everyday life. As you turn these pages, you will gain an understanding of the manifold and interrelated experiences of crises that activists contend with, as well as the various class-based activist projects that seek to address such crises through work on active citizenship, professionalism, social entrepreneurship, and sustaining hope. In reading through the many stories of Lebanese and non-Lebanese engaged in Crisiswork, you will learn how, in the very pursuit of the elusive ethos of change, multiple life worlds emerge. This book is also a humble invitation to experience solidarity and empathy with others, even if, or precisely because, their suffering and struggle may seem far away from some of you. I ask that you think and feel together with my interlocutors and me, and that you reflect on the complexity of these activist experiences of crises and on the profound meaning of sustaining a struggle for alternative presents and futures. Often amid precarity and fear. Reading these textured stories of competing ways of doing something will familiarize you with the differential experiences of crisis constituting contemporary Lebanon. But these stories will also, I hope, defamiliarize you from your certainties about identity, activism, and politics. In reading stories that oscillate between national unity and communal belonging, working for change and preserving the status quo, hope and despair, inclusion and exclusion, you will recognize the contradictory pressures that activists experience in their daily lives. Crisiswork requests that you notice the convergences between your own lives and the complex life worlds that Lebanese inhabit, which would facilitate meaningful pathways to new translocal connections and solidarities. As we reflect together on the political and ethical ambiguities that many Lebanese face while creatively navigating crises, perhaps we can all learn from and continue to build on crisis work in Lebanon and elsewhere. So let me begin with, okay, sorry, this wasn't, oh my God, I forgot to, okay, I'm starting right now, sorry. Okay, I'm just starting this. Okay, let me quickly explain why Lebanon, why activism. This is a question that I have received, of course, from my Lebanese interlocutors who are obviously used to having spies in their countries. You know, me coming from Stanford, they ask me about Hoover Institute, are you from Hoover Institute, da da da. So I think it's important to kind of explain like why for me it's Lebanon. In fact, it was a little accidental. I have initially developed a project in Abad, Syria, heritage and urban renovation, because I was in love with, you know, the old cities in Halep and Aleppo and Damascus. But then the war broke out, and obviously that place, Syria, became unresearchable, making many of us relocating to different places. And for me, of course, at the beginning, nobody knew that Syrian uprisings will last that long. So I'm like, okay, literally the distance between Damascus and Beirut is 2 hours driving. So let me go to Beirut, wait there a little bit while taking more Arabic classes, and hopefully when things are better, then I will go back. And I never went back, except that now in my recent project I'm focusing on Syria. But then, of course, that was a moment of crisis for me as a PhD student. Okay, I cannot do this project. I have been preparing it forever. What do I do right now? But then, just like the crises in my book, that particular instance of crisis became very generative and productive for me, even though initially I wasn't foreseeing that. So, of course, I have known a lot about like Lebanon from books, as we have to read a lot of books through our comprehensive exams, and we go to field after comprehensive exams. So I knew a lot, but still, like, I did not know what kind of a project that I can do in Lebanon. And that was helpful in a way, because I am like, okay, you know what, let me talk to people. Let me spend time with many groups as possible and see like what is interesting for them. So for me, that was like a moment of like essential anthropological point of discovering what matters to local people. And obviously, I always have my own, interest in everything, but I focused on listening to people. And the word listening is really key for me, as it will come up in different parts of work, this talk. So realizing that a lot of different communities in Lebanon talk about Lebanon, Lebanese, nation, belonging, civic activism, also like future building. That kind of like little bit puzzled me, because the majority of the work on Lebanon, recently there are works about activism, but at the time in 2010s, the majority of work on Lebanon is like sectarianism, like focusing on one kind of community, Shia, or Sunni, or a different group of people. So kind of like divide the country into sectarian communities and emphasizing that this is the place to study sectarianism. And I have seen that pressure, from different colleagues as well. What about sectarianism? What about sectarianism? But then people talk in a way that go beyond sectarianism. So I had decided to study the imaginations and relationalities of cross-sectarianism in everyday life, and what does it mean to connect with different groups and different communities in everyday life. And that eventually connected me to activism, because it was mainly the different groups of activists that were working on this idea of, promoting cross-sectarian relationalities, unity, etc. And especially when I have noticed that Lebanese activism is impressively diverse and rich, not only due to substantial Western funding, which is really important, was and still is, but at the same time due to decades of long, strong heritage of leftist activism in Lebanon since 1960s. Definitely I'm here resisting to ideas that, activism or civil society is promoted only thanks to the Western donors. So eventually I came up this question or interest about so what does agency mean? How do we understand political agency, but also social agency, when people live in or experience profound uncertainty and precarity? So very quickly, for some of you maybe not familiar with what anthropologists do, because I know it's a little bit also vague for some of us too. So it was, this book is mainly based on my long field work between 2012 and 15. But of course, I have had various follow-up visits to Lebanon, and then I have also conducted digital ethnography, not only with my existing interlocutors, but also met with new people. Especially during COVID, it was really nice because most of their meetings were taking place on Zoom. But basically, at the time, in addition to participating, right, we take pride in participant observation in everyday life of various activist groups. And when I say activists, I will come to that. I refer to people who self-identify as activists. I conducted in-depth interviews with various groups, not only activists, but also Lebanese politicians and bureaucrats, intellectuals, journalists, program managers of social entrepreneurship programs, representatives from universities, other places. These groups are all working on and thinking through, okay, how can we save Lebanon? What can we do for Lebanon? Of course, textual archive from local newspapers, NGO booklets, and I also conducted social media analysis, which was very helpful because Facebook and WhatsApp were and still are very popular for many Lebanese. And also, something I wasn't planning to, but I kind of was forced to doing because of my participation in one NGO, is do a survey. Anthropologists typically don't do surveys with various activists, and that was really helpful in terms of coming up with good, interesting numbers. So eventually, the major question and argument have become for this book, first of all, how does crisis shape? And how is it shaped by activist politics? And then how do diverse activists imagine change differently and to what effects? In this sense, I will come to, how does that work? What do I mean? But here, some of the major findings or arguments as I have engaged with these questions, and I'm still engaging with these questions, is first of all, crisis in the social science literature has long been studied as a depoliticizing discourse. And these works have been very, very helpful for me in understanding how people talk about crisis or consider crisis. A key work, for example, is Anti-Crisis by anthropologist Janet Roigman, which is a fascinating book. But these works also delimit crisis to something that is produced as a discourse by hegemonic power groups. But in Lebanon, I found out that crisis is not not only a depoliticizing narrative, but it's also a politicizing narrative. It is a lived reality, it's an experiential reality, but also it's an embodied experience. And when I say embodied, I do mean it in terms of pain, trauma, depression, so many other embodied practices that I discussed before. And ultimately, I suggest this is one of the key contributions of the book, is that crisis is something generative. Because we usually talk about crisis as something very negative, delimiting, it causes all sorts of like different troubles. And in this context, I look at crisis as a very fertile ground, not only for, you know, political mobilization. You see in this picture, you know, Lebanese protesting. And let me remind you, since early 2000s actually, there have been many mass protests in Lebanon. So we are talking about a very active, vibrant society that goes beyond activism and civil society. And so this is one way that crises can become generative. It, you know, brings people outside and with the idea of like, I cannot take this anymore. But also it is generative in the way that people just start talking about things. And I will come to that in one of the slides, like, who are we? What are we doing? What kind of a future do we want? So it's also generative in terms of existential questioning, not only individually, but I mean mainly collectively. And in terms of activism, this is the second area that my book makes a contribution to. I theorize activism as an open-ended, ambivalent, and contradictory process. Because if you, again, look at the picture, you would see somehow, just like migrants and refugees, typically activists as a group also imagined as a monolithic category. When we talk about activists, we somehow tend to see them as kind of similar to each other because we imagine them always in solidarity, collaboration, etc. And I'm showing the tensions, the problems, the differences, class-based differences, gender, other differences causing problems among activist groups. So differences, tensions, and dissonances is something I make an emphasis on. So crisis work, I think this is important to emphasize at this point. Let me see if I'm forgetting anything important. Yes, so ultimately, that generativeness is about everyday experiences of suffering, violence, precarity, are being harnessed to assert individual and collective agency. So I'm looking at the relationship between crisis experiences and agency, both individually and collectively. So expressing a determination to do something, and I will come to that more in some other slides. The idea of we must do something is how I came up with the word, as Halil said, crisis work. So I have heard many people continually talking about we must do something, which in Arabic, lazim na'mashi, we must do something, we must do something. And initially that's like, what do these people tell? It's just very ambiguous, it doesn't mean anything, but at the same time, that ambiguity becomes very productive because the idea of I must do something or we must do something attracts a wide span of people into that shared space of activism. Because people have so many different, often competing, conflicting ideas of what we must be doing, that urge to do something creates this expanded field of the idea of activism and practice of activism. So crisis work is the word that I use to describe multischolar engagements with crises to enact change, and multischolarity point I will come to later. But so doing something is the way that I came up with theorizing the word crisis work. Engaging with crisis way in a way that seeks solutions, try to find new meaning. So something maybe you're wondering, okay, she keeps talking about crisis, what kind of crisis is happening in Lebanon? And I'm sure like many of you are familiar with what's going on right now in terms of the war with Israel and poverty and unbelievable scenes of destruction and everything. But let me take you back to 2012-13 because we have this problematic sense of presentism. We think like this is what's happening now. But during my fieldwork, people had a very strong sense of crisis. And at the time, this is something really interesting for me to think about, that almost everyone telling me like, this is the worst time in Lebanon. we have never seen anything like that. Yeah, civil war was difficult, that was challenging, but this is the worst time. And then as I have continued my research in connection with different groups, in every literally scene from 2019 protests to 2020, economic crisis and explosion, and then now, and the 2024, that people continue to see it as this is the worst time of Lebanon. So there's something, I guess, about the presently experienced crises that it feels for people like this is the worst. I see it more like an experiential, and I don't do like suffering Olympics. I don't think it is possible to, meaningfully compare different periods and say like, oh, this is, so I'm not doing that. I'm not assessing which crises were more real and more important. I'm trying to understand how different groups see or experience crisis differently. But very quickly, during the time I was doing my field work, this is the time that Western media frequently reported as the spillover of the war from Syria, and more than 1 million Syrian refugees were displaced to Lebanon, in addition to other neighboring countries, making Lebanon a country of 4 million, as having the highest per capita refugee. And this is just one among other things. There were 29 bombings and assassinations that occurred in Lebanon, killing so many people, injuring so many others. So there's this continual lived experiences of war, which many scholars of Lebanon describe as living in war. And of course, political instability, infrastructural failure, electricity, water, literally even in very rich upper middle class neighborhoods. Sometimes I lived in one of them because I have been displaced due to these insecurity and safety issues many times within Lebanon during my fieldwork. Even in very rich neighborhoods, like we didn't have water and electricity for days, which was unexpected and unusual for me. So these experiences were not only limited to low-income communities, but of course mainly experienced by them. And of course I want to also emphasize, and this is something I discussed in the introduction as well, during those times that I had received so many emails from Stanford, my department was like, you should come back, you should come back. You cannot do field work. But I was like, people live here. If people live here, I can live here too. So I took advantage of the fact that I wasn't, and I'm still not, an American citizen. I am a Turkish citizen. I said, okay, don't worry about it, because they see me as a liability problem. It's not that they care about me, of course, nobody cares about you, but they're like, oh, what happens if something happens to her? Who will be responsible? So I'm like, don't worry, it's the Turkish government who will be responsible for me. If anything happens, that I will, make them responsible. Still, I was asked to come up with a very specific rescue plan in case something happened, and also like I was required to describe like how am I dealing with such and such situation, what am I doing in everyday life. So I had to also deal with all these safety concerns coming from here. Meanwhile there, yes, those things were happening and it's difficult, but I just want to remind everyone that the media, or in general, I think it's the US state institution, determining this number 2, number 3, safety, they are highly exaggerated. I want to say this as someone who lived in Syria, Turkey, Lebanon in different times, they are highly, highly exaggerated. So amidst everything happening, and again, I'm not trying to be dismissive about what is happening, but at the same time, I want to say that people live there while these things, including bombings and violence, are happening. So some of the shared narratives in Lebanon, which activists were trying to counteract with the idea of like, we must do something, was Lebanon is a failed nation. We can come back to it later, with the civil war and difficult transition from being a French colony into a sectarian nation, and we are the idea of that we are these are like all strong national narratives that Lebanese tell to themselves, many Lebanese tell to themselves. Lebanon is victim of repeating cycles of violence. Lebanon has no future. Lebanon cannot change. So whenever I talk to any activist about what they're doing, what they're doing, and they typically, invoke, some of these narratives and say like, we don't want that. We want to change this. We don't want to, either think that way, or we don't want to have a future nation that we are still living in those circumstances. Okay, so I think it's time for me to come more into this we must do lazım namashi idea, because as we anthropologists do love it, the linguistic discussion here is highly important, both for the Arabic word activist, nashid, but also at the same time the word work that I use in Crisiswork. Ahmed is very, very rich. So I'm just going to read quickly my quote. The root of the Arabic word, Ahmed, in doing something, could be translated into English as to do, to work, to labor, to act, or to take action. The urge to do something which characterize activist subjectivity in Lebanon, thus connoted activeness, yet left the contours of this activeness ambivalent. Within this ambivalent imagining of individual and collective responsibility to address crises, diverse activist Lifeworlds in Lebanon took shape and generated a pluralistic yet contentious space of social and political struggle. In the introduction, I don't want to dwell too much on it. I also go into discussion with various theorists on politics and political agencies, such as Hannah Arendt, who had very clear-cut distinctions between, labor, work, politics. So in a way, the way working, doing something, transcends the boundaries of work, labor, politics that we still tend to imagine in the Western world. So for many, many Lebanese, activism, yes, it was only about, it was about protests and rallies and all of these things we tend to associate with activism here, but it was much more than that. They considered volunteering, they considered humanitarian efforts, all as part of activism, be it in the grassroots or NGOs, doesn't matter. They also thought caring for others, the word care is really key in my book, caring for others, family, community, and their selves, oneself, is also considered as part of activism, because the idea here is something some anthropologists, such as Tanya Ahmed, emphasize, looking for normalcy, seeking normalcy is an important to understanding Lebanese activism. And also dignity, another concept that anthropologists have written a great deal about. So any activity producing dignified life, sense of normalcy, have been seen as part of activism. So in this sense, a lot of things we as critical scholars, such as, for example, empowerment projects or entrepreneurship that we tend to theorize typically as depoliticizing, can not only be perceived but also become and practiced as politicizing in this context. So we have alternative modalities of self-food as well, and this kind of creating self-food or building agency is something that can be explained by Daniel Rutherford's idea of biopower from below, because as you know, biopower in Foucauldian terms is usually from above. So biopower from below is helpful to understand, I suggest, the generative, rich political, and ethical life words. And also, the root for nashata, that's the root in Arabic, connotes the multivocal meaning to be active, to work on something, and to work for a good cause. Many Lebanese view nashid as someone who would actively intervene to change not only the system, but any problematic circumstances in her immediate world. So in this sense, the Arabic word also has a more expansive meaning. I think this is also helpful in the way that so many people self-identify as activists. Actually, not only in Lebanon, but I would suggest many parts of the Arab region as well. So this is okay. Finally, I want to read for this part. Okay. I also want to finally read, speaking of linguistics, what we understand. Okay, so I had done also a little bit of research thinking about the word crisis, Arabic word crisis, azma. Very quickly, in ancient Greek society, the term crisis, denoted a singular moment of decisive judgment. In current times, crisis in English mainly describes a condition of demise and exception, often in reference to major prolonged problems in economics, finance, politics, or diplomacy. Azma, the Arabic word for crisis, has a much broader historical use. In 545, azma was used to denote hardship. The well-known 13th century Arabic language dictionary Mukhtar al-Sihah defines azma as distress and drought. In contemporary Arabic, many circumstances that cause distress can be called azma, including prolonged problems or issues of varying scale and severity. For instance, one common term for heart attack is azma albiya, literally heart crisis, with crisis symbolizing the intense distress felt in the heart. Similarly, azma nafsiya, psychological crisis, is used for a wide spectrum of mental disorders and psychological distress. In Lebanon, I heard these usages as well as phrases such as azma sayr, traffic crisis, and azma bil ala'a, relationship crisis. And there are also other phrases as well. These are just examples. Depending on the context, azma could mean crisis, hardship, distress, struggles, scarcity, shortage, deadlock, or conflict. So as the historical genealogy of the term reveals, crisis narratives in Lebanon were not limited to well-known political or social events or those featured in media. For many Lebanese, the word was intrinsically entangled with the everyday problems of Lebanese and Lebanon. A minor problem on an ordinary day could easily be called a Lebanese problem and tied to the crises that country was going through. When a water tank in one's building was quickly depleted or a car cut off one's rightful passage, many interpreted such incidents as Lebanese problems rather than as isolated incidents, seeing them as a product of the country's crisis. Oftentimes, a conversation about a personal experience related to family, romance, work, or fun could quickly slide into negative commentaries about Lebanon and its people. The association of daily problems and personal experiences with the larger crises of the nation facilitated a proliferation of public conversations about Lebanon and the Lebanese among diverse communities. So through these linguistic analyses, I'm also trying here to explain how crises are both everyday experienced, lived phenomenon, but also directly tied to larger political discussions about identity and belonging. I think this is really important. Something I also see as methodologically important in this book is the colonial approach, and I want to say how I want to explain how I see this, because in the literature, decolonizing, decolonization, the colonial approach might be understood in very, very different ways. The way I have studied this project and written this book in a decolonial way has three main components. And this part is something that I really feel very proud of. So first of all, I do engage with my interlocutors as co-intellectuals, meaning that I do not, in trying to go beyond extractive anthropology, I consider my interlocutors not only as people who can recognize and interpret what is going on, but at the same time, I try to collaborate with them in theorizing what's happening. Lazım namishi, like we must do something, is just one example to how I developed or conceptualized the idea of crisis work. There are many others in the book, so I think it is really important to collaborate with our interlocutors when we are building theory and conceptualization. And obviously, the legacies of colonialism are extremely important in understanding politics and activism in Lebanon. We can come back to it. It was initially French colony, and later the US institutions have become very, very influential in Lebanon. And finally, I do suggest that intersectionality and focusing on differences and challenging the idea of monolithic category of activists, and showing asymmetries of power among them is also central to coming up with a decolonial approach to activism. So these are the chapter titles, and I'm not going to go through the chapters as I want to just cover the key points, but for those of you who are interested, we can come back to this in the Q&A section. So the first one, basically, crisis narratives, focuses on how different Lebanese communities understand crisis. So I have mentioned in the previous slides that there are, of course, some shared notions and lived realities and facts about crisis, but at the same time, there's significant unevenness in the way that crises are being experienced. And one main discussion I have in this first chapter is comparing low-income community of activists with more middle-class community of activists. And while middle-class activists focus on, building Lebanese future, non-sectarian identity, all these like civic activism concepts, for low-income communities, it was mainly about infrastructural issues, how they're affecting their lives, and what can they do. It's more trying to change the everyday realities of the country rather than building civic identity. Because in general, civil society studied in Lebanon as like civic activism. There is that, but there is definitely more to that. Because I do believe that activism is a space that can be and that is being repurposed by different groups, and that is one of the key findings in the book, and that is something that I emphasize in my article as well. So very quickly, when I say imagining a multi-scholar change, this is in the second chapter, I discuss how, in addition to trying to build civic activism, people talk about laws, changing the laws, changing the culture, but also changing the individual. The idea of changing the individual, working on both structures, seeking a structural transformation, but also seeking a cultural and personal and interpersonal transformation, seeking change in different scales of everyday life and broader context is key to understanding how activism is viewed and experienced in Lebanon. And then these are the third and fourth chapters, which later on became my articles. Very quickly, the third chapter, Aspiring Professionals, focuses on how low-income communities took advantage of civil society projects in ways that led to their social mobility. And I do see social mobility as an important concept in our understanding people's agency. And then with entrepreneurial activism, I also show for both middle class and low-income communities, entrepreneurialism is far from being a neoliberal concept that depoliticizes, but it is a concept that is historically intertwined with leftist agendas, because I think it's kind of striking to find those leftist groups who are proudly entrepreneurial. That also ties to, of course, Lebanon's history. But in both of these chapters and articles later, I show not only people do understand different things from these concepts that we are very much familiar in Silicon Valley, but at the same time, they can repurpose them based on the historical background of Lebanon. And the next chapter, fifth chapter, focuses on hope, because the idea of hope as anthropologists study, it's a process. Hope is not a fact. I'm not, or we should not be judging, are these people hopeful? Is there hope in Lebanon? Because it's not a fact, it's a process. And I do discuss how different activist projects purposefully, explicitly, intentionally try to produce hope, and I ask to what effects. And I suggest that while producing hope expands the horizons for many people, it also reproduces cynicism and pessimism, because the times that people are awaiting is that will be better. Okay, like in some of those projects, you can see this in the Lebanon 2020. The idea in that public event was Lebanon in 2020 will be amazing. So you make people to believe that in 2020 everything will be amazing, but when 2020 comes, and it's one of the literally worst, agreeably worst years in Lebanon's history, it produces significant pessimism, disillusionment, and despair. So I discuss in this chapter some of the complex consequences of futurism in activist projects. And the final chapter is, as one of my reviewers put it, is surprisingly less compassionate towards my interlocutors, because here I ask, you know, these people are doing great things. They spend a lot of time with their activism. They care about their communities, their selves. Like they are precarious. Everyone I'm talking here, including middle classes, are to some extent precarious in Lebanon. It's kind of a shared experience with all of its unevenness. But at the same time, there was something striking to me, which is both refugees, Palestinian and Syrian, and at the same time, migrant workers from the global south, such as migrant workers from the Philippines and Ethiopia and others, were significantly and strikingly invisible and racialized. And many people, you know, wrote about this in the context of Lebanon. But something that's less debated is how activists who are actually, you know, fighting against racism or fighting for equality, freedom, etc., can be explicitly racializing in their own discourses. So I try to explain what is going on here. How do certain groups can justify seeing other groups as ungrievable? And ungrievability is a concept that is discussed compellingly by Judith Butler. Again, we can come back to that later. So usually that ungrievability concept is used in the context of refugees and migrants, but generally speaking, there are all those different groups that are being made ungrievable. One thing I want to just very quickly emphasize, as I'm running out of time, right, few minutes I have, is that all of this process have eventually produced various moments of mass protests. I do suggest that if we go back and look at the vibrancy of activist places in Lebanon, they really help us to understand how different groups of people are gradually, increasingly become what I call activists in becoming. So people don't suddenly become activists. It's often like they are increasingly, gradually, thanks to experiencing crises, connecting to people who call others to do something, and all these relationalities generate both activism and mass protests. There was also significant NGOization and grassroots movements. Not only NGOs, people-to-people networks, as several scholars call it, have been growing in Lebanon, especially after the 2024 Israeli attacks. Just a quick reminder, again, these slides are here and we can come back to them, that the Israeli-Lebanese situation, I don't want to call it conflict, it's problematic. The situation goes back to a date that is prior to the foundation of Hezbollah. This is something really important to highlight, because there's this widely shared misconception here is like, oh, Israel is attacking Lebanon because of Hezbollah. If Hezbollah was not there, then Israel would not do it, which is historically and factually wrong. To minimize Israel's problem with Lebanon to its problem with Hezbollah. And I'm sure that some of you have been watching the news that so many, you know, Sunnis, Christians, and communities from other groups, not only supporters of Hezbollah, was killed in those attacks, and the current ongoing war. Just a few quick slides about how it's a very, very sad situation, of course, in so many ways, but at the same time, there is still something mobilizing about this particular new crisis moments, not only by NGO activists, but from different communities. One thing that is really touching here to me is like the picture on the very right, where you see displaced Ethiopian migrant workers. By the way, from the recent wars, not only the Lebanese, but refugees, migrant workers, so many different communities have been displaced. and seeing displaced migrant workers who have been historically otherized in this country, who have been labeled as ungrievable, treated as ungrievable, to see them as giving, as helping, supporting Lebanese is quite striking and something to reflect on. So we see here an interesting subversion of social hierarchies due to complexities of war, and similarly, a lot of different spaces have been turned into shelters and relief centers. As you might have understood by now that I love the word repurposing, as I want to really see, acknowledge people's agency. I want to emphasize the first one because it has been covered substantially in Western media. Sky Bar, which is a very famous bar, sheltered 400 people in October 2024. So not only schools were closed and turned into shelters, so many different places in Lebanon were turned into shelters. And I see those moments and practices as potentially being understood through the concept of crisis work. So these last slides are kind of reflecting on, okay, this book was written, for the context of 2014, 15, what is its relevance right now? So certain situations are continuing, but also certain conversations are continuing as well. This is my last slide. People still talk about, what do we do? What can I do? What should I do? They ask to each other. They seek answers to what can we do in such a constraining situation. And I still hear from people, I must do something, we must do something. These are all in quotations. Optimism and pessimism coexist. One question I receive continually from different audiences, so is this an optimistic account? Is this a pessimistic? And I'm like, it's both. And I like to answer that it's both, and I think it's both. There's something very pessimistic and optimistic about all of this. And when looking at these conditions, again, not only we as scholars of Lebanon, but people in Lebanon, they continually discuss what is activism, what is politics, what should these things be? And also, almost everyone is going through trauma, just like I have discussed in the book. So of course, in so many ways, the current situation is different from 2013 war, but perhaps in the experiences of war, in uncertainty, in precarity, and also, viewing the country and politicians completely incompetent and corrupt. And still, like the whole Hezbollah-Israel debate, almost 45% of this is with the recent survey, Lebanese population being against Hezbollah, and around 60% is supporting its war against Israel. So all of these experiences, discussions, conversations are continuing. And one thing I do care a lot is at the end of my book, in the conclusion, I mentioned that people in Lebanon that I talk to, my longtime friends, new friends, they continually tell me, like, tell this story to people over there. Because it's just so sad in some level how they feel or believe we in the US as people are so powerful. We have the agency, to somehow change things for their lives, either through, pressuring our government or pressuring Israel. So I do not really believe the power of the West to change all of these things for them. But I do acknowledge and respect the wish to be heard, to be seen, to be cared. And this has been the motivation for me to write and finish this book. And finishing the book is really hard. And I do urge you to ask yourselves, like, how can I care about all of this? Or what, so much things happening in Lebanon, what do all these things mean for me? So trying to connect at the individual experiential level, I think is central to building solidarity. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it.
So I will discuss a few points before moving on to QA. So Lebanon, Beirut, Beirut was known as the Paris of the Middle East back in the day. Such a unique place because it was designed to be a Christian majority in the middle of Muslim majority Middle East, and it had like a consociational democracy as the ruling regime, which is, which means each institution of the government, they have different heads from one of the sects or religions, like Christian, always Christian president basically, and it was designed to be that way, but then like the population changes and then Christians become like minority, and in the middle of repressive states, like a liberal basically island of in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and becomes finance center, and it is very hard not to fall in love with Beirut when you go there. And it's like, yeah, it's very short, but yeah. And you might know like Lebanese diaspora is also maybe even more populous than Lebanese inside the country. So it is such a unique and interesting place, and we also like discuss it through like the invasion of Israeli invasion, but also Syrian influence, and especially under the Ba'ath regime when they try to disrupt that uniqueness of that country. And a lot of Sunnis in Lebanon, like I observed that they complain about that Syrian influence and assassinations, Halil assassination and all. So this book covers the 2010s of that time, and we can remember it was at least the background of, for instance, first Occupy movement over here, then the Arab uprisings, the Arab Spring as we used to call it that time, and also like in Turkey around the same time, like there was the Gezi protests. So it is kind of a similar landscape in certain ways because of the new use of social media, new forms of activism, less ideological and more cross-sectional. So Crisiswork, like this is a new term that she coined, that Yasemin coined. It is it takes crisis as generative, and it is multi-scalar engagements with crisis to enact change. And it talks about ethical-political dimension. Ethical-political is a word that I used a lot in my dissertation, and I love it. Actually, I might have gotten the domain name for that too. Ethical-political is something that I value a lot, and I'm quite very glad to see that. And in this context, crisis, like she means how they become political, like how crisis work becomes political. By politicization, I refer to deliberate processes of continually exposing to oneself and others to alternative modes of thinking, feeling, and acting, as well as to the process of socializing, caring for, and building solidarities with diverse communities, for the purpose of implementing discursive and practical strategies and tactics to generate desired social and political changes. So this is a very significant part, and interestingly, one of the most interesting parts of the book is yoga becomes political in this book.
It is so contentious, I don't want to mention it here.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. So she has a crowd of like interlocutors. It's a mixed crowd, both from low income and high income and middle income families. And it is a Shiite majority, but in terms of confessions also it is a mixed crowd. And she especially talks about the tension between the low income and the middle income activists in this context. So when we consider Lebanon, like one of the important facts is you might argue that Lebanon is a place where state building and nation building have been incomplete, maybe because of the colonial legacy that all the rest of the states over there in the Middle East, at some point they became repressive, but that also led to more bureaucratization and state building, like in Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria. In Lebanon, it was as a liberal island, constitutional democracy. That process was never complete. And hence, nation building also was arguably incomplete because of that. Because they divided, they racialized, so to say, like they sectarianized the system from the very beginning. So people identified with different groups, religious communities. So you can remember as an example like how the US racialized everybody because like you have to classify black, white, and they don't make any sense to outsiders who are coming from overseas. I have I'm gonna build a few questions on top of this. So there is since it's an incomplete state building, nation building, there is also when that happens, NGOs, basically civil society steps in, especially when there is liberalism as dominant mode, and that was the case. So you don't see that kind of civil society elsewhere in the Middle East as strong as Lebanon, and it was because they killed the civil society in other countries, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, even in Egypt. I was in Egypt, and I found striking parallels, by the way, between the youth activism there when I was there back in 2008, 7-8, and what you described. And other thing, normally, since the civil society place is missing, then Islamists moving because mosque is the only remaining place where you need to organize. You can organize, and then counter publics emerge out of the mosques, and you don't see Islamists are that much talked about, except Hezbollah, which is a different matter because it is a reaction to the Israeli invasion. So Sunni Islamism is not that much pronounced. So I have, building on it, I have a few questions for Yasemin, for you. So first, you talk about Crisiswork. A very dumb question. Aren't all activisms in reaction to crisis, or at least most activisms in reaction to crisis? Just to clarify that. But also, why action? Why if you're talking about activism, why not crisis activism but crisis work? So you differentiate between Hannah Arendt's labor, action, and work, and you picked work as the term there. Does it have a special significance? Why not crisis activism or crisis action? And other thing that I keep wondering is, again, building on the early point I made, the 2010s activism. So we saw that in Gezi protests as well. They tried to depict it as ideological, but it wasn't ideological. It was political, but not ideological. But in this context, in Lebanon, where we covered, you talk about they end up being more progressive and leftist. Yes. But we don't see the good old ideological groupings here, like Islamist, socialist, communist, liberal. You don't find, that these distinctions are discussed that much in this space. So why is it not there, or if it is not there? And in terms of the outcome of activism, I also kept wondering, is this a result of incomplete state building and nation building, so that everything you do becomes an important critical action for social change? If the state did its job providing social services, how would that have been? And is this whole activist space, this activist sphere, does it result in your primary concern, which is nation building? National identity and belonging. Does it result in that purpose, like by activisms, because activism in low-income cases, she argues that it is also class-making. So low-income people by activism join the middle-class sphere. But do all these people all together, like with their activism, is it something that makes up for this failed nation-building process, and is it resulting in, is it filling the gap and resulting in the national consciousness, so to say? Like there are lots of things that, it is also for the US society. Is there an American nation? It's been an ongoing debate, as a parallel to what we see in Lebanon. And some common tragedies, sometimes they are uttered to say that, like 9/11, for instance, although like it didn't, continue that way, but like at some point, these common tragedies, like the common tragedies that they have, like the Civil War, of course it is destructive itself, because you are dividing the society, they fight each other, and then like, it's very hard to fix that, to heal. But do common tragedies, do they have that kind of effect of nation building, or do you think, like the activisms on the ground, they are more effective building the nation from bottom up? Finally, are there any parallels that you see with Occupy movement, Gezi protests, other Arab Spring movements? So these are my 2 cents on this excellent book. Thank you so much again for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much. There are a lot of really helpful feedback, questions. Thank you for reading the book very carefully, and I look forward to talking more with you. So maybe I quickly reply and take questions.
Yes. Then we will just move on to questions after you quickly.
Very quickly, say a few minutes. Yes. Then because I want to hear from other people, and we can continue later if you want. So many good questions. Yes. Okay. So first of all, I love the question, is all activism reaction to crisis? One question is similar to the question that I have been receiving about, is everything activism? I also received that question. So, okay, activism is like so many things, but is everything activism? So it's kind of similar to that. But this one is, I guess, a little easier because I think in many parts of the world that in different times, this is also a temporal situation, many self-identified activist groups can focus on problems and issues, and I think qualitatively the word problem or issue, that's why I think some people call it like issue-based activism, is different from crisis. Crisis is like not only the intense form of a particular problem, but also it's like a breakthrough that changes everything. So definitely there have been many circumstances in which people do not necessarily view what's going on as a situation of crisis. They don't characterize it that way or live it that way, or nobody defines it that way, but we still see many vibrant forms of activism. But this is something interesting to think about. I do think, though, one can argue that despite that activism is not limited to perceptions or experiences of crisis, I think somehow I do argue that you made me realize that the crisis situation somehow is more mobilizing than other situations. The perception of crisis, the experience of crisis, war, displacement, big economic crisis, like you talked about Occupy movement, for example, same with other forms of protests that happened in the US, they are substantially related to the big moments of economic crisis. So definitely I think engaging with crisis is mobilizing in so many ways in different parts of the world, but there have been also other times when people didn't think there's a form of crisis, but they do think like there is an important problem that we need to work on, right? So there's this. About socialist Marxists, unfortunately, there are not right now, since 2000s maybe, there are not many socialists or Marxists in Lebanon. Like there was a significant vibrant socialist Marxist community in 60s, 70s, early 80s. They have kind of, I think like in Turkey or many other countries in the Middle East, they have become more liberal. So there's that just general liberalization of the Arab left that affected Lebanon as well. But however, there have been some people at a time, and there is an article by Sun Hokbol. He argues that in Lebanon, leftism is mainly defined as being anti-sectarian, not like pro-equality or justice. So there's also a specific definition of leftism in Lebanon as mainly focused. You would find, unfortunately, I do say, there are labor movements and groups, but they are sort of marginalized. In this book, I've focused on more visible groups, both grassroots and NGOs. And people who identify as leftists, they mainly focus on changing the sectarian system, but less so on economic inequality that we tend to think about when somebody says socialism or Marxism. Do they succeed on building national identity and belonging? I would suggest both yes and no, and that's a very good question. Even though I'm not mainly assessing, success, we anthropologists are usually blamed for not, being good at that,
no,
right?
Me being political scientist there.
Okay, yes, especially political scientists, like, so what? What do you say? Is this good or bad? It's like, I'm just voicing people, right? So, in some ways, yes, because they generate spaces where people continually discuss about Lebanon and Lebanese as an idea, but also as a practice. So definitely these spaces, activism, help many people, residents of Lebanon, becoming, and this is something that that a lot of activists explicitly told me, that, before coming to the NGO, I was considering myself more as, Shia or Sunni, but through interaction with other communities or exposure to these ideas, I also realized that we have something in share. So when you bring people together, they do realize they have shared things. So to some extent, it is definitely building that, but then to some extent, no, because some of the tensions and problems are not dealt very productively, as I discuss in the book. And mainly one big problem is, I identify there is what I call hyperfuturism, which is when a project fails, okay? And I was like, okay, let's discuss this and take lessons from it. So it's like, what happened? And I personally like someone who likes to discuss what happened. And people are like, no, let's not focus on the negatives. Let's move on. Let's go to the future project. So I think negating to face what has happened as a result of existing projects failed has been undermining these projects. I think it's important to reflect, be self-reflexive about the existing projects. And finally, do common tragedies unite people? I think this is also yes and no. For example, in the Lebanese context, the port explosion in 2020, August, and before that in 2019, the huge economic crisis, it united people, for sure. But for the 2024 and 2026 Israeli war, it divided, and it has been dividing and increasing sectarianism, because so many people are, Hezbollah is dragging us into war. So you would find so many Lebanese, from 35 to 40% of the population, who suggest people know that Israel is doing wrong things. It's not that they don't blame Israel, but these groups blame Hezbollah more than they blame Israel. So there's that division about what do we do with Hezbollah question. So the recent wars were not were not uniting. Parallels with other movements, you're right, social media is definitely important. Although I think social media is, I personally don't see social media as the precipitator of these movements. They are
overrated.
Yeah, it's definitely over-highlighted. And because I think because Western groups want to take credit for what's happening there. Oh, we created social media, so we are, somehow creating change in the Middle East. I think it's overrated. But other than that, especially with 2019 global protests, I want to remind you that, there have been so many collaborations between different countries. So 2019 was the year of global protests. So you would see, and actually had a project about that. One of my articles was published as part of a project here in Cultural Anthropology of the Public. We compare how, in Chile and Iraq and India and Lebanon, all of these movements are learning and inspired from each other in so many ways. So definitely there are inspirations, collaborations, moments of learning between different activist groups, and this is important to acknowledge.
That was the feminist song, Aslan Images that we translated into Turkish,
Oh,
all the way on.
I didn't know this one. I will learn it. Okay, so definitely in Turkey too, definitely
I think
there's something global about
emerged in Chile or Argentina, I don't remember. But thank you so much. And let's get some audience questions, yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. Without having yet read the book, hello.
Oh, wow.
Without having read your book yet, I get overall an optimistic picture because of because of the vitality of civil society.
Right.
At the end of your talk, you mentioned that your interlocutors and the people that you lived with in Lebanon asked you to get their message out.
Right.
I'd like to suggest, not to fill up your travel calendar, but there are at least 4 or 5 countries in the EU with essentially no civil society or very weak civil society. There's been recently there's an article, I think in The Guardian or someplace, about democratic backsliding in the EU.
Oh, yeah.
This includes, well, not to mention names, but some are bigger countries than Lebanon, some are roughly comparable in population to Lebanon. So if you were to make a little circuit from Italy to Croatia to Slovakia,
Right.
It might be a very interesting discussion comparatively. Anyway, thank you.
No, that is so important. Very quickly, yes. You're right. Lebanon is also a Mediterranean country, not only a Middle Eastern country, right?
Yes.
There's
And
this
it has
whole
some genetic
Euro-Mediterranean thing, and it will be interesting to have these. You compared the Middle Eastern countries, but when we think about Euro-Mediterranean,
Right.
it would be really interesting to think about. And I haven't been honestly recently thinking about the weakness of civil society in European countries. I will look into it. Yes. Is it do you observe a gradual weakening of civil society, or it has always been weak? How?
Well, in some countries, it seems like it's been going on for a very long time.
Oh.
In other, I think in Italy, which is a very unusual case, of course, because of the bigger population.
Okay.
It seemed like it was very stable for a while, and then it slowly started to. I don't know if that's just the realities of Italian politics or what. But.
Thank you. Yes, this is really, really interesting.
Wow, I'm tempted to say nothing at all. I enjoyed the presentation very much. I'm sorry I haven't read the book, but I am going to buy the book.
Thank you.
And I look forward to reading it. And I appreciate the extraordinary combination of scope and the fact that you are an anthropologist is, from my point of view, because I have been poisoned by something we used to call political science, which is not a science. So I'm delighted with the anthropological perspective. However, I can't get rid of the disease because that's what my doctorate was on, right? I'm stuck with that. I can't change that.
She also has doctorate in political science.
No, I see the tension, no problem. I'm also in global affairs program, so I see the tension.
Yeah.
But I would love to hear what you're referring to specifically.
Well, in one sense, it's hard to say, to use the word delightful, given the topic that we have, right? This, the violence and so forth. It is, nevertheless, from my point of view, as a former political scientist, quote unquote, it is actually delightful. Intellectually delightful. That we are looking at something which is typically ignored from the discussions that I'm familiar with, much too familiar with, where political science dominates. Did you attend the lecture yesterday on religion?
Oh, I was not here. No, I came at night.
Yeah.
I-
Well, I mean, I want to
I
go
watch
into
If
that.
it's
but
recorded, if it's recorded, I can watch, yeah.
Pardon me?
If it's recorded, I can watch it later.
Yeah. Well, cause and effect, okay, that is what drives political science, or at least it did when I was studying political science before I abandoned the discipline, right? And anthropology doesn't really have to concentrate on that so much.
Right.
You know, we know that the term thick description did not come from a political scientist. It came, of course, from an anthropologist, right? Clifford Geertz, right? And so on the one hand, I'm kind of fascinated by the notion that we would take something which we're calling a crisis and examine it from various perspectives, including the perspectives of the people that it affects and who are demonstrating and so forth and so on, right? I mean, imagine that the lights in this room suddenly went dark, okay? Now, that would be a crisis that would immediately call for somebody getting out there and finding out how can we turn the lights back on. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the normative situation, you know, remember Lenin, what did Lenin, "Что делать," he said in 1917, what is to be done? And so if I can put myself in your shoes as an ex-political scientist, I think a concern for you is perhaps in part as to whether or not reading the book leads people to review the book that was not written. In other words, the book that was outright, this should be done, that should be done, then this should happen and that should happen. In other words, solutions rather than the investigation of the crisis itself. The idea being that the crisis is bad, it's damaging, and so how do we get rid of it? When you use the term effective several times in your comment, you were getting near to where I'm at, or where I would suggest that one should perhaps consider being at. You know, what is to be done? One possibility is that nothing can be done, and that shows up in the despair and cynicism that you describe. And maybe, I don't know, maybe at the beginning of the book you're going to say, you know, my purpose as an anthropologist is to understand this crisis. It is not to make policy recommendations as to what can be done to get out of the crisis, right? And so, you know, I fully respect that. On the other hand, given the extraordinary costs in terms of lives and so forth, which you described, perhaps to some extent the anthropological emphasis on analysis, if you will, is, you know, at least somewhat limited or called into question by the urgency of what can be done. And I think here's an example from political science. Yesterday, I don't remember his name, I've never met him, professor spoke here at Stanford, and he said, religion does not cause war. The whole thing was about cause and effect. That's political science, right? Something's happening, it has a consequence, the consequence is bad, how do you change it, right? And I'm just wondering, since I haven't read the book, but I will read it, I will buy it and I will read it. I mean, let me just end on a specific, 1943, right? And you know what I'm talking about, right? The National Pact.
Oh yeah, National Pact.
1943. So a political scientist would say, oh, forget about all this. Look, what happened in 1943 established this extraordinary relationship. If you're the president, then you've got to be a Catholic, right? You can't be a Muslim. But on the other hand, if you're the prime minister, you see what I'm saying? So the allocation that you take these soft, not necessarily soft in terms of their intentions, but slippery notions, and you require people to be identified with those particular notions, right? It's built into the system, right? And so already the political science would say, never mind this, you have a structural problem. So the problem is not that people are wandering around wondering what to do. In fact, the very question what to do is the one that I'm trying to deal with, If there's nothing that can be done, then one should say it, but if there are things that can be done, and that's the kind of standard, you go back to 1943, and then you follow it from year after year after year. And you bring in, of course, all the actors, Hezbollah and so forth, obviously. You bring in the foreign actors. What is the balance, for example, in terms of causation between domestic breakages and conflicts and the role of the outside world, right, including particularly Israel, right? So there's a whole set of interpretations that are there as well. And since I haven't read the book, I can't really comment on the conclusions that you reach. But I do think that what you're doing is in a way very important, precisely because it is not, at least as I read it, political science. And therefore, political scientists should read it and suspend for a moment their policy-driven notion. Lenin, what is to be done, how can we solve this problem, right? So I think contextually, I like very much what you're doing, and I hope we can talk about it later. But that omission from the political science point of view, the point of view of quote-unquote realism, that's crucial.
Let's get your response because we need to,
I will continue thinking about it. You are right about all of this tension and methodological differences, and I appreciate how you see this in terms of pros and cons, and not necessarily political science is better than anthropology, right? It's like they have both pros and cons. I think I am more like, I have offered a lot of analyses, so we anthropologists do interpret, analyze, make arguments, for sure. It's not, we are against journalism. It's not only we are voicing people, we are analyzing what's going on there, making connections, showing contradiction, complexity, etc. But at the same time, we don't make explicit policy recommendations, as this is seen as kind of like condescending to those people.
Right.
There's also that issue of like, who are we? We can do that. But at the same time, I do hope when someone shows the courage, the reader or observer audience, shows the courage to face the complexity, and I think this is the moment of pause, right? Like, let's see the complexity. Let's initially get confused. Actually, this is why I moved from political science to anthropology, to expose myself to that confusion of complexity and not coming up with a clear formula, including causality or something else. So this is complex part that anthropologists take pride in saying, hey, I'm going to show you how complex this is, right? This is, you go to an anthropology conference and hear anthropologists saying. But then we hope by showing the courage to see this complexity, we can generate new conversations. And political scientists, can go up from here to have their own conversations. So I'm not against policy proposals, even if I'm not doing them necessarily. But I do hope seeing the complexity for everyone can potentially lead to better policies.
Yes, absolutely.
That's what I believe.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we can come up with better policies if we, keep denying, avoiding the complexity. That's what I believe. But I will think more about all these comments. They're very nice. Thank you so much. Very helpful.
You want to say something?
Yeah, if I may, as a last question. For those of us who like to conduct research or like to be intellectually curious about kind of countries or regions of the world that we don't come from, I'm just wondering, do you speak Arabic? What led to, I assume your background is Turkish, so like, did you have any barriers in going to Lebanon and doing anthropological and ethnographic work if you didn't have full access to the language? And how you navigated that?
Yeah, no, great question. Luckily, it can be answered very quickly. I think this is one of the differences between political scientists and anthropologists. We almost are required to know the language. Like political scientists methodologically have the luxury. I'm not saying political scientists don't learn the language, but they can pass by using an interpreter, translator, or just relying on someone. But for us, you can now find an anthropologist writing a book. An anthropologist, for example, would have never asked me that question because they know that I was supposed to learn Arabic and the Lebanese dialect.
Not just
and
Arabic.
it has not only Arabic. So let me say when I was an undergraduate student, I took Fusha courses in Istanbul, which is classical Arabic. Then I, of course, forgot. Then at Stanford, and Arabic is a very challenging language. At Stanford, I took 3 years of intense Arabic. And then over the summers, I also took intense classical Arabic. When I went to Lebanon, this just means nothing. It means something because I can read documents, I can understand the news. So classical Arabic is the news Arabic and media Arabic. But then just talking to people, it's like nothing. So I have also taken months and months of Lebanese classes. There are similarities, but there are many differences, including tenses and everything. So yeah, it has been very painful. And you know, you can never get as fluent as local people. However, I got to a point of being almost 90-95% understand the local people, which was very helpful. And one benefit of actually not being fluent in the local language was that I had to listen. I had to listen because when you know the language, you just want to say something, right? You hear somebody who's like, your brother is like, you just want to say something. But I knew like when I wanted to say something, it would have taken me so much time, possibly like I would be misunderstood, and I was like, okay, let's focus on listening. So it helped me as an extroverted person to develop my listening capacities. And I like listening to people in Arabic, so it was in a way, and in many ways it was a humbling experience, you know, to talk with a really bad accent and then everything. But I was able to definitely do almost all my interviews, unless the person insists, in all Arabic. Yes, all interviews, all everyday interaction, everything was in Arabic, yes.
And you did it yourself?
Every quotations, everything in this book is in Arabic.
Okay, and you were able to interview yourself without an interpreter?
Oh yeah, I never used an interpreter, yes, definitely.
Okay.
No, I was able to communicate, interpret. One thing I was like, oh, you said for future researchers. Okay, one thing this has really helped me. And I do know a lot of researchers, I'm not going to name people, both anthropologists and other people from other disciplines coming to Lebanon, studying in courses a lot of Arabic, but not being able to speak it. So they were asking, how did you speak? So 2 things. First of all, I like to a lot of people saying I am, half Lebanese and I don't know English and French. So when you say in Arabic, with broken Arabic, like you don't know English and French, I was like sometimes saying half Italian, half Spanish. They are convinced to speak in Arabic. But then they know you speak English, they are, let's speak English. So I did lie a little bit. And number 2, I lived with a Lebanese woman who knew French and Arabic, but didn't know English. And that kind of living together, it really did help. So living with a native speaker who doesn't know English or whatever your language is, definitely very helpful. That really helped me a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you so much on that note. Yeah, we thank you again, Yasemin.
Thank you.
And to many more opportunities, occasions where you will present, future books of yours.
Thank you.
Not
Enjoy.